So we normally think about language in terms of sounds, and you can even have languages that are communicated through touch, but we don't use smell. It would be a really interesting challenge if that's the type of communication system that an intelligent species is using.
So how did you get interested in the idea of alien languages?
I got into this in a sort of sideways way. When I came to SIU, I started working with students on projects related to constructed languages and invented languages. Ended up editing a book on that through Oxford University Press on how to use invented languages to reach students and teach them about linguistics. And from that, I sort of made these connections with some folks that had some affiliations with organizations that are sort of interested in questions of extraterrestrial communication. And I really approached this question as, well, how can we utilize this sort of concept of thinking about aliens, thinking about communication to better understand what we know about human language?
So our excuse for chatting with you about linguistics is the new movie Disclosure Day.
Let's today is today's
And I read an interview actually where Emily Blunt said that she sort of went into the studio and made as many strange noises as she could make with her body to give them stuff to work with to create this pivotal scene where she's, a conduit for alien language. But my understanding is that's often not how languages are constructed. Could you tell us a little bit about what the process often looks like in a fiction context?
Oh, absolutely. So, normally when we're talking about a fictional context, we're talking about, needing human actors, I guess like Emily Blunt, but human actors to be able to perform these languages. And so we end up with aliens that have a physiology that is virtually identical to humans. And I think, Star Trek is such a great example of that, where everyone looks like a human, but maybe they have a slightly different thing on their head or,
yeah. So many different kinds of nose bridges across the galaxy.
Exactly. But their vocal tract is identical to a human. And, obviously, they're all speaking English because of the universal translator and things like that. But, you need to have human actors that are producing these languages. So we're going to stay in the realm of things that are producible by our physiology. And more often than not, because these are being produced in the Western context, they're going to be utilizing the sound systems that are like languages that we find in Western European languages. So that puts a pretty big limit on the types of things that we are looking at. And when we think about an alien context like Disclosure Day, the physiology of these other types of potential alien species could be so radically different that we wouldn't be able to necessarily produce those sounds.
Yeah. Well, and just on the topic of the sounds being used, something I noticed about the little bit of alien language in Disclosure Day was that there was a lot of sort of popping and clicking, which you also see in the Aliens franchise. And like you said, when we think about what makes a language sound alien, we're often coming from this very Western context. Are there human languages where those sorts of sounds are actually used?
Absolutely. So there are languages that utilize click sounds. So these are sounds that involve a different type of vocalization where they, rather than pushing that air up through our lungs and producing the sounds that I'm producing right now, they use a differential air pressure within the oral tract to sort of create these pops and clicks. Now, they also utilize those other sounds. So like you hear about these African clicking languages, they're all languages primarily spoken in Southern Africa. They're mixing these clicks into the types of sounds that we'd be very, very familiar with. The types of clicking that we saw in the trailer is not like a human language, where these clicks are much more occasional.
I have a 7-month-old, and sometimes I stop and think about how obvious it is to me what sounds I'm making to him that are, linguistic and which ones aren't. I am a little concerned that I have got him believing that lip buzzing is like a really important aspect of our language. So we'll see what happens with that. But anyway, I would love to hear more about, like you said, how studying, these fictional alien languages and talking about them can help us think more broadly about linguistics and about the search for alien life.
taking a step outside of our sort of what we know about humanity and what we know about the sort of languages that we've already encountered and saying, well, what does that mean if we weren't looking at humans? Are those going to be the same types of things? Are those the same types of expectations? That allows us to sort of better understand the limits and nature of language within that human context. So I think that it really is helpful for us to be able to take that outside view and sort of look at things as if we weren't just talking about humans. And I think that's, again, really what drew me to this idea of exploring alien languages. Obviously, some of the folks that are involved in this are very interested in the potential of communication. I'm definitely more on the skeptic side of that, but I think that it does create some interesting questions about what are the types of messages that might be receivable, what are the types of things that we would expect maybe if we were to receive that we'd be able to translate, and if a potential extraterrestrial intelligence was to receive, that they would be able to say, oh yes, this is an intended message of communication.
Yeah. And what do you think that message could look like?
Some sort of mathematical operation, some sort of communication that is related to mathematical operations, because we know that for them to receive a message, they would have to be probably through something like radio signals. So they would need to have developed a degree of technology that would require some sort of mathematics. But the types of messages we have sent, now these are not messages that are likely to be received, but the Voyager plaque and things like that are much more representative and maybe things that are much harder for non-humans to understand.
What are some of your personal favorite constructed languages from fiction?
So I have a soft spot for Klingon.
Don't we all?
I don't, yeah. My mother years ago gave me a copy of Hamlet in Klingon. Now, I haven't studied them in great detail. I'm certainly not one of these folks that can speak a constructed language or use a constructed language or anything like that. But I enjoy Klingon in part because it is designed in such a way to be so alien. So it uses a object, subject, verb, or object, verb, subject. One of the two. It's object first, which is unlike human languages. We like to put either our verb or our subject at the start of the sentence. So in Klingon, you would say pizza ate me, or pizza me ate. I can't remember if it's object, subject, verb, or object, verb, subject, which is very unusual. It also utilizes a bunch of sounds that are done in a sort of unnatural way, so it feels very alien. But you also have to go back and think about the Tolkien languages, the original behind the sort of construction of invented languages. But, I think it's such a cool, creative project for folks to do, to sort of think about developing a language that is completely disconnected from, what we use in our day-to-day life and apply it to these sort of fictional settings. So I applaud anyone that really gets involved in that hobby.
Yeah. So if you were the guy there when we made contact with intelligent aliens, what would your first step be in trying to establish communication?
Oh, wow. That is such a difficult question. I think it would depend so much on how the message was received. So, if we think about these sort of science fiction contexts, a ship lands and aliens walk out, well, that's going to change the way that we try to communicate. I think, staying in that sort of realm of science fiction, I think the film Arrival does a really great job of sort of encapsulating the sort of linguistic processes that would occur within that. So you would try to establish just some basic naming terms, something that would allow for some degree of cross-language communication. Now, if we received a radio signal, there could be a lot more planning involved in sort of decoding and preparing a message back. So I think the nature of the contact would inform that so much. I think one thing that is really important to think about with language, when we look at human language, is that it's modality non-specific. So we normally think about language in terms of sounds and our auditory hearing or maybe reading, but signed languages, which use gesture and the visual system, are fully formed languages, and you can even have languages that are communicated through touch. But at the same time, there's those modalities we don't use. We don't use smell, And there's no reason to think that a intelligent alien species may not utilize some of these other types of modalities that would make this sort of cross-species communication almost impossible, or at least extremely difficult, because the way that the olfactory system works is so fundamentally different than the way, say, the auditory system works, and smells linger in the way that sounds don't, gestures don't. So it would be a really interesting challenge if that's the type of communication system that an intelligent species is using.
Wow. I studied Mandarin in college, and as someone who wasn't raised in a tonal language, the tones were very hard for me. I was always second-guessing myself, and now I'm just imagining that, but also trying to make sure that I'm producing the right smell at the right moment, and terrifying.
Yeah, exactly. And then, and the smells would stick around, so you could have like layered things that we just don't have in human language.
No, very cool. Thank you so much for coming on to chat. This has been really interesting.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.